The preacher slammed his Bible shut so hard that the sound cracked through the little church like a gunshot, and Henrietta Grady felt the echo of it somewhere deep in her chest, in that hollow place where hope had been living for the past 6 months. "I will not do it," Reverend Josiah Crale said, his voice low and trembling with something that looked like righteousness but smelled a great deal more like cowardice. "I will not stand before God and perform this ceremony. Not today. Not ever. Not so long as I draw breath in this county." Henrietta stood at the front of that little church in her best dress, the pale blue cotton one she had pressed 3 times that morning and mended at the left sleeve, and she felt every pair of eyes in Dustfall, Texas, boring into the back of her skull. The small congregation that had gathered, neighbors and townsfolk and a handful of curious onlookers, said nothing. They were watching. They were always watching in a town like Dustfall, where secrets had the shelf life of milk and scandal traveled faster than the noon stage. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. Standing beside her, Harlan Wick, the man she had agreed to marry 3 months ago for reasons that now felt as distant and mistaken as a fevered dream, placed a proprietary hand on her elbow. His fingers were cool and dry, and they gripped with the particular kind of pressure that reminded her she had no choices here. Or at least, that was what Harlan and his allies had always wanted her to believe. "Reverend," Harlan said, smiling that smooth, oil-slick smile of his, "I'm sure we can come to some kind of agreement." "There is no agreement to be reached," Reverend Crale said, and he was not looking at Harlan at all. He was looking at Henrietta, and his watery blue eyes were full of a terrible apology that he was clearly not brave enough to speak aloud. "The matter is settled." Henrietta's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt and breathed slowly through her nose and thought about what it meant that the Reverend, a man she had known since she was 12 years old, who had baptized her, who had prayed over her mother's grave, was refusing to marry her to this man. She thought about what that refusal was really saying, and whether the secret she had buried in the back of her heart, the one she had told herself she was foolish for keeping, was perhaps not a secret that belonged to her alone. And then she thought about Clark Ashford. The sun had been riding low and fat over the prairie that morning, painting everything amber and rust, when Clark Ashford had arrived in Dustfall for the second time in 6 months. The first time had been an accident, a water trough, a thrown horseshoe, and a stubborn animal that refused to go another mile without proper shoeing. He had stayed 3 days, and in those 3 days, Henrietta Grady had made the single most critical mistake of her 24 years of life on this earth. She had let herself be seen, not in the way a woman is seen when she is being looked at, in the way a person is seen when someone looks past the surface of them, past the careful arrangements and the practiced smiles and the defensive perimeters, all the way down to the complicated and contradictory truth of who they actually are. Clark Ashford had done that to her in the span of a single afternoon, sitting across from her at the counter of her father's hardware store, talking about nothing at all, about whether the summer rains would come early, about the particular stubbornness of mules as compared to horses, about the way the light in West Texas had a quality he had never found anywhere else. And somewhere between the mule conversation and the light conversation, Henrietta had forgotten to protect herself. That had been in March. It was now the 5th of September, 1882, and Harlan Wick's hand was on her elbow, and the Reverend was refusing to marry them, and Clark Ashford had ridden back into Dustfall 2 days ago on a different horse with the same unhurried confidence, and the same way of looking at her that undid 6 months of careful reconstruction in about 4 seconds flat. She had not planned for any of this. Harlan Wick was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He was 31 years old, possessed of a prosperous cattle operation on the eastern edge of Grady County, financially comfortable, respected by people who respected that sort of thing, and he had come to Henrietta's father, Gerald Grady, in June with a proposal that had seemed, in the exhausted arithmetic of a woman watching her father's health decline and the hardware store's debts accumulate, like the only reasonable solution available. Henrietta had accepted. She had told herself this was practical. She had told herself that love, in the storybook sense, was a luxury available to women whose fathers were not coughing blood into their handkerchiefs by late summer, and whose family stores were not 6 months behind on payments to the wholesaler in San Antonio. She had told herself a great many things that now, standing at the front of a church with the reverend's refusal still ringing in the air, felt like very expensive lies. What Henrietta had not known in June, what she had only begun to suspect in August and confirmed with sick certainty 3 days ago, was the nature of the arrangement Harlan Wick had made with Reverend Crail. Not a bribe, something worse. A threat dressed up in the language of community and Christian obligation, built on a piece of information about the Grady family that Harlan had obtained through means she could only describe as predatory. The Reverend had been willing to perform the ceremony in exchange for Harlan's silence about something. Something old. Something her father had done before Henrietta was born, in a darker chapter of his life, that Harlan Wick had somehow uncovered and was holding like a loaded weapon. But arrangements made with men like Harlan Wick had a way of reversing without warning, and whatever had changed in the past 24 hours had changed the Reverend's calculus entirely. He had decided that performing this particular ceremony was a sin he was not willing to carry, regardless of what Harlan Wick might do with the secret he was holding, which meant that the secret was almost certainly already out. Henrietta pulled her elbow free of Harlan's grip. It was a small motion, not dramatic, not loud, but every person in that church saw it happen and felt the shift in atmosphere that followed it, the way you feel a change in wind direction before you see it in the grass. "I see," she said to the Reverend very quietly. "Thank you for telling me." "Henrietta," Harlan said, and his voice had lost its smoothness, had developed a sharp edge that she recognized as the sound of a man whose plan was not going the way it was supposed to go. "I need some air," she said, and she walked down the center aisle of that church with her head level and her hands still pressed flat against her skirt, and she pushed open the double doors and walked out into the blinding September light of Dustfall, Texas. The town's main street stretched out before her, dust and boot leather and horses tied to rails, the general store and the telegraph office and the saloon and the livery and the barber, and all the other small organs of this small body of civilization, dropped down on the edge of a very large wilderness. She stood on the church steps and breathed and did not allow herself to come apart. She had been standing there for perhaps 45 seconds when she heard his boots on the ground behind her. Not Harlan's boots. Harlan had a particular walk, deliberate and slightly too heavy for his size, the walk of a man who wanted you to hear him coming. These were different. These were the kind of boots that moved across ground with the loose, unhurried economy of a man who had spent most of his adult life covering long distances on horseback and had consequently developed a relationship with the ground that was essentially humble. Clark Ashford came to stand beside her on the top step, and he did not say anything for a moment, just looked out at the street with her, and she was grateful for that more than she could have explained. "He refused," she said, "because there was no reason to pretend he did not already know." "I heard," Clark said. His voice was low and even, and it had that faint Western drawl that was not quite Texan, not quite anything she could place precisely, a voice that had been shaped by a lot of different places. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with dark hair going a little gray at the temples before its time and gray eyes that were more complex in their color than they appeared at first glance, not simple gray, but the shifting, complicated gray of clouds at the edge of a storm that has not yet decided what it wants to do. "Harlan will not take this quietly," she said. "No," Clark agreed. "He won't." She turned to look at him then, and she felt the full weight of everything she had refused to let herself think about for 6 months pressing against the inside of her sternum. "Why did you come back?" He looked at her sidelong, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one. "You know why, Clark." Her voice was a warning. "I came back because I made a mistake in March," he said simply. "I rode out when I shouldn't have." I told myself you had made your choice and I had no business complicating it, and I spent 6 months persuading myself of that. And then I got to a certain point, somewhere around the middle of August, where I ran out of ways to convince myself of something I did not believe. Henrietta looked back at the street. A dog was sleeping in the shade of the farrier's porch across the way. 2 women from the Methodist congregation were watching her from the door of the general store with the particular intensity of people collecting information. "I agreed to marry Harlan Wick," she said. "You did," Clark said. "My father's store is in debt. My father is ill. Harlan offered security." "I know that too." "Then you understand that this is not simple." "Henrietta." He said her name with a careful precision, each syllable given its proper weight, and it was such a contrast to the way Harlan Wick said her name, which was always a little too fast, a little too proprietorial, like a brand being applied, that she felt the difference in it physically. "Nothing about what I came back here to say is simple. But the Reverend refusing to marry you this morning strikes me as what my mother would have called a sign from Providence, and I have ridden a long way in a lot of heat to arrive at this particular moment, and I would very much like to have a conversation with you before sundown." Before sundown. She looked up at the sky. It was not yet 10 in the morning. The sun was bright and fierce, and the day stretched out before her like an open plain, full of complications and choices and the consequential irreversible weight of the next few hours. "Then you had better start talking," she said. They walked. There was nowhere private to talk in Dustfall that would not be observed and reported on, and both of them understood this. So they walked out to the edge of the town, where the street became a dirt track, and the dirt track dissolved into the open grassland. And they kept going until the town was a small ragged line behind them, and the sky was enormous, and the wind moved through the grass with that low, constant whisper that Henrietta had always found more comforting than any human voice. Clark told her what he knew about Harlan Wick. He told it plainly and without embellishment, in the manner of a man who has gathered information carefully and intends to present it accurately. He had spent part of his time away looking into Harlan's background, not out of any specific plan but out of the nagging instinct that something in the man's presentation did not match the reality beneath it. What he had found had been, in his words, illuminating. Harlan Wick's cattle operation was not prosperous. It was, in the careful accounting sense of the word, insolvent. The herd numbers he had presented to Gerald Grady were inflated by approximately 40%, achieved through a combination of borrowed animals temporarily added to his headcount and a selective presentation of his grazing leases that omitted the ones currently in dispute with his neighbors. The debt Harlan Wick carried was substantial, and the bank in San Antonio that held the primary note on his property had given him until the following spring to either produce sufficient collateral or face foreclosure proceedings. Henrietta listened to all of this with a very still face and a very turbulent interior. "He wanted the store," she said when Clark had finished. "The hardware store and the land it sits on," Clark confirmed. "Deeded through marriage. Your father's name on the property, but Gerald Grady is not a well man, and a husband has certain legal standing with respect to a wife's inherited property in the state of Texas in 1882 that—" "I know what the law says," Henrietta said. She knew exactly what the law said. She had been thinking about it since June with the particular grim focus of a woman who is intelligent enough to identify the trap she has stepped into but has not yet found the mechanism by which to release it. "How did he know about my father?" she asked. "The old secret, the thing Harlan had been holding over Reverend Crail." Clark was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she understood that whatever was coming was going to be difficult. "Your father was not always Gerald Grady," Clark said. "Before he came to Dustfall, before he built the store, he lived for a period under a different name in a different county. There was a matter, a land dispute that became a legal matter, involving a Comanche family who had been using land that a speculator had, through a process that was not entirely lawful, obtained title to on paper. Your father, in that previous life, served as a witness in a proceeding that resulted in that family being displaced. Henrietta stopped walking. He testified falsely, she said. It was not a question. He was young. He was frightened. The speculator was a powerful man, and the alternative was his own ruin. He has spent the rest of his life trying to be a better man than the one he was in those months. Clark said this without judgment, but clearly and honestly, because he was not the kind of man who softened true things into comfortable untruths. Harlan found the court records. Apparently the speculation business was a side enterprise of Harlan's grandfather, and the family kept those records. Henrietta stood in the middle of the open grass and absorbed this, and felt a complicated grief for her father and a blazing, clarifying anger at Harlan Wick that was, in its own way, almost a relief after months of numb resignation. "If the Reverend refuses," she said slowly, "and if word of my father's past gets out, which Harlan will ensure, because Harlan does not leave weapons in the holster when he is angry, then the store's reputation suffers, the debt becomes more urgent, and Harlan expects that I will be forced back to the altar regardless." "That would be his calculation, yes," Clark said. She looked at him. The wind was moving his hair slightly, and he was watching her with that direct, careful attention he had, the kind that did not demand anything but also did not flinch. And she thought about March and the afternoon in the hardware store, and the conversation about mules and light, and how she had afterward stood in her bedroom and stared at the ceiling for a long time, feeling the particular disorientation of someone who has just discovered a thing they did not know they were missing. "What is it you want, Clark Ashford?" she asked. "Say it plainly." He did not look away. "I want to marry you," he said, "today if you will have me, before sundown." She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment she heard his boots on the church steps. She had known it, probably, from the moment she had been told, the previous evening, that he had ridden back into Dustfall. "You know almost nothing about me," she said, but even as she said it she felt the hollowness of it, because the truth was that he knew considerably more about her than any man she had ever met, and she knew it. "I know that you are 24 years old," he said. "I know that you have been running your father's store since you were 19 because your father's health began failing, and there was no one else to do it. And you did it without complaint and without any particular fuss, and you turned a struggling operation into a functioning one. I know that you are frightened of the dark in a way you consider embarrassing, and that you compensate for it by always keeping a lamp in the hall. And I know that you think this is a weakness, and I think it is simply a true thing about you. I know that you love West Texas despite yourself, that you have tried to leave twice and come back twice, not because you had to, but because something about this particular landscape has its hooks in you. I know that you have a habit when you are thinking hard about something, of pressing your thumbnail into the pad of your index finger like this." He made the small, precise gesture, "and you are doing it right now." She looked down at her hands. She was. "And I know," he continued more quietly, "that you spent approximately 15 minutes on the 4th of March of this year explaining to me the difference between the quality of morning light and afternoon light in West Texas, and that in all my travels, which have been considerable, I have never in my life listened to someone talk about light the way you talked about it that afternoon, and I have never forgotten a single word of it." The silence that followed this was long and full, and the wind moved through it like water. "You have nothing to offer me in the way of security," she said, but her voice had changed. It was softer. She was not arguing. She was asking. "I have $1,200 in savings," he said, "which is not a fortune but is not nothing. I have skills. I'm a capable man. I have been offered a position as foreman on the Alcott Ranch, 40 miles east of here, which comes with a house and a salary that would be sufficient for 2 people, and then some. I have no debts and no dark secrets and no false presentation to make. I am not offering you what Harlan Wick was offering, which was a lie dressed as security. I am offering you what I actually have, which is real but smaller." She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger and watched the grass move. "My father," she said, "his debt." The store debt I can cover, Clark said. Not all at once, but over time, if I am in a position to contribute to it steadily. And the matter of what Harlan intends to reveal about your father, I have been thinking about that since yesterday evening. And the land your father was a witness against in that proceeding, the land the Comanche family was displaced from. I have been in contact with a man in Austin who handles certain land restoration matters on behalf of a coalition of interested parties. The original title, as I mentioned, was obtained through fraudulent means, which means it can be contested. It does not resolve what your father did, but it addresses the underlying injustice in a way that might provide the Reverend and the community a different context in which to understand your father's history. Henrietta turned this over in her mind. She thought about the family that had been displaced. She thought about the young man her father had been, and the old man he had become, and the cough that woke her up at night. She thought about the difference between a hidden motive that destroys and a dark past that a person has spent decades trying, imperfectly, to atone for. That would not happen overnight, she said. No, Clark said, but it would be started. She looked at him for a long time. He stood in the sun and the wind and was exactly what he appeared to be, which was, she had come to understand, one of the rarest things in the world. If we are to be married today, she said slowly, the Reverend has refused us. There is no other minister in Dustfall. There is no other minister currently residing in Dustfall, Clark said, and there was the precursor to a smile again, a little more developed this time. But there is a justice of the peace. Her eyebrows went up. Marcus Alney, Clark said. I spoke with him this morning early before the ceremony at the church. He is authorized under Texas state law to perform civil marriages. He is also, I believe, the man who extended your father's first line of credit when he came to Dustfall, and who has considered Gerald Grady a friend for 20 years. Henrietta stared at him. You spoke with Marcus Alney this morning. I did, before the ceremony. Yes, you were planning for the Reverend to refuse. I was planning for the possibility, Clark said carefully. I had certain information about the nature of the Reverend's arrangement with Harlan, and I thought it likely that, under the circumstances, Reverend Crail's conscience might prevail. I thought it was worth having a second option prepared. And if the Reverend had not refused? If he had married Harlan and me before you could, she stopped. She heard what she was saying. She was saying us. She had been saying us in her interior thoughts about this situation for some time, in fact, and hearing it out loud was a small earthquake. Then I would have had to live with that, Clark said. It would have been your choice and I would have respected it, but I would not have ridden back here without trying. The sun was climbing. The shadows were shortening. The day was burning itself toward noon, and somewhere back in that little town Harlan Wick was recalculating, and Reverend Crail was sitting with his conscience, and her father was probably sitting in the back of the store pretending to do inventory because he could not bear to be at the church for the ceremony, which was its own small heartbreak. Tell me one thing, Henrietta said. One true thing about yourself that is not flattering. He did not hesitate. I have difficulty trusting people, he said. Not in the way of a man who is deceitful, I am not that. But in the way of a man who was betrayed once, significantly, by someone he thought he knew, and who has since that time kept a distance between himself and the world that has cost him things worth having. I rode away from Dustfall in March partly because you frightened me. Not in a bad way. In the way that things you want very much are frightening because the risk of losing them is proportional to how much you want them. She heard the truth in it. She recognized it because it was very nearly her own truth, told from a slightly different angle. Who was it? She asked. The person who betrayed you. A business partner, he said. A man I worked with for 3 years who, it turned out, had been using my reputation and my skills to cover for a great deal of dishonesty. When it came to light, I was associated with it in ways that took considerable time and effort to disentangle myself from. That was 5 years ago. I have been since then a man who works alone. And now you want to stop working alone. Yes, he said, with a very specific person. Henrietta looked at the sky. at the impossibly wide Texas sky with its high white clouds moving slowly in from the west. And she thought about what fear was and what courage was, and whether the difference between them was always as clear as people like to pretend. She thought about what it meant that the Reverend had refused. She thought about Harlan Wick's cool, dry hand on her elbow and the way she had never once, not for a single moment, felt safe in his presence. She thought about the hardware store and her father's cough and the $1,200 and the foreman position on the Alcott Ranch, and whether love was a luxury or whether it was, in fact, the only thing worth building a life around. She thought about the light. The way she had talked about it in March without thinking, as though to a person who would understand. The way he had listened. "All right," she said. His expression changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind of change that happens in a person's face when something they have been bracing against for a long time suddenly stops requiring bracing. A small, careful release. "All right," he repeated, "but there are conditions. Tell me." "My father is consulted and his blessing is obtained before any ceremony takes place, regardless of how the conversation with Marcus Alney is timed." "Agreed and obvious," Clark said. "The matter of the land and the Austin contact moves forward regardless of what it costs me socially in this town. If my father's past becomes public, we address it honestly, not defensively." "Agreed." "And I will not be a woman who is managed," she said, and her voice had a precision to it that was not anger but was its close cousin. "I will not be a woman whose opinions are decorative. I ran that store for 5 years, and I can run a ranch house and a household account, and I have views about most things and I intend to express them." "Henrietta," Clark said, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and slightly amused, "the specific quality of your views, expressed with the specific clarity you bring to their expression, is one of the primary reasons I rode back here in September heat when any reasonable man would have stayed in the shade." She felt the smile happen on her face before she could stop it. It was not her polite smile, the one she deployed for customers and neighbors and social occasions requiring managed pleasantness. It was the real one, the one that came up from somewhere unguarded and probably looked slightly ungainly and did not care. "Then we had better go talk to my father," she said. They walked back toward town side by side, not touching, not yet, that would come, and the light was doing exactly what Henrietta had described in March, that particular mid-morning quality that turned the dust of the street into something almost golden and made even the most prosaic elements of a small Texas town look like they had some significance. Gerald Grady was, in fact, sitting in the back of the store. He was 61 years old and looked older, thin now in the way of illness, with white hair and careful eyes that had always reminded Henrietta of a man who was watching for consequences. He had a ledger open in front of him that he was not, she could see, actually reading. He looked up when she came through the back door, and when he saw Clark Ashford behind her, his expression went through several changes in rapid succession: surprise, understanding, something more complicated that might have been relief or might have been guilt, or was possibly both at once. "Papa," Henrietta said, and sat down across from him at the small table, and Clark Ashford took off his hat and stood near the door and let the conversation be between father and daughter. She told Gerald Grady what she knew, not cruelly but completely. She told him she knew about what had happened before Dustfall, before the name Grady, before the store and the community and the careful life he had built. She told him she knew what Harlan had been using it for, and what the Reverend had been threatened with. She watched her father's face go through all the colors of a complicated shame, and she thought about what it meant to love someone imperfect, someone who had done a bad thing and spent a lifetime paying for it in ways that had never quite canceled the debt. "I should have told you," Gerald said. His voice was rough. "Yes," Henrietta said honestly, "you should have, but you are telling me now in the only way available to you." He looked at Clark for a long time. Clark met his gaze without looking away and without any aggression, just the plain, direct regard of a man who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "What is it you want with my daughter?" Gerald asked. "To marry her," Clark said. "Today, if she will have me and you will give your blessing. To provide for her honestly and to be a decent man to her, which I intend to do for as long as I live." "You have no property," Gerald said. "You have no ranch." "I have an honest employment prospect and 1,200 in savings, and the kind of conviction that comes from having thought about something very carefully for 6 months," Clark said. "I am not the most prosperous man who has ever come to you for your daughter's hand, but I am the most sincere." Gerald Grady looked at his daughter. Henrietta looked back at him, and she did not hide what was in her face, which was a complex mixture of love and grief and a very clear and resolved certainty. "He came back," Gerald said, not quite a question. "He came back," Henrietta confirmed. Gerald was quiet for a time. The store creaked around them in the heat. Somewhere in the front, the bell above the door rang, and neither of them moved to answer it. "There is a thing I ought to have done years ago," Gerald said, "that I was too frightened to do. A letter I ought to have written." "An acknowledgement," he looked at Clark. "The young man mentioned to me this morning that he has contacts who address these land matters." Henrietta looked at Clark. He had spoken to her father that morning too, before the church, before all of it. She felt something shift in her understanding of the past 24 hours, the careful preparation, the absence of any improvisation, the sense of a man who had come back not with hope but with a plan. "He did mention that," Henrietta said softly. "I would like to write that letter," Gerald said. "I do not know that it changes what I did, but I would like to write it." "Then write it," Clark said. "I will see that it reaches the right people." Gerald Grady put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, his old hands with their hardware store calluses and their ink stains, and then he looked up at his daughter. "You love this man," he said. She had not said it yet, not to herself, not out loud. She had been circling it for 6 months with the careful avoidance of someone who is afraid of what naming a thing commits them to. "Yes," she said. "I believe I do." "Then you have my blessing," Gerald said. "Both of you." Henrietta reached across the table and took her father's hand, and the three of them sat in that dusty, ledger-smelling backroom for a moment that was small and private and utterly removed from all the drama occurring in the street outside. And she thought that of all the moments in this complicated day, this might be the one she carried with her the longest. Marcus Alney's office was on the north end of the main street, a narrow, sun-beaten space squeezed between the post office and a vacant building that had previously housed a millinery. He was 62 years old, a compact, white-mustached man who had the particular gravity of a justice of the peace who has taken his legal authority seriously for many years, and he opened the door when they knocked with the expression of a man who has been expecting this knock. "Clark," he said, and then to Henrietta, "Miss Grady," and in his voice was something warm and careful that she recognized as the sound of a man who had always liked her father and had been watching the situation of the past few months with considerable private concern. "Mr. Alney," Henrietta said, "I understand you spoke with Clark this morning." "I did," Marcus said. "Come in, please." His office was cool by comparison with the street, the curtains half drawn against the worst of the morning heat, the walls lined with the record books and legal texts of a man who takes documentation seriously. There was a small table in the center of the room, and 2 chairs in front of it, and a larger chair behind it where Marcus took his seat, and Clark and Henrietta sat down across from him. "I should tell you," Marcus said, looking at Henrietta directly, "that I am aware of what Harlan Wick has been, let us call it leveraging with respect to your father's history. I have known Gerald Grady for 20 years. I know the kind of man he has been in Dustfall, and I know the kind of man that certain legal technicalities and certain cruel men sometimes make a person appear to be on paper. I am not a man who makes his decisions based on paper alone." "Thank you," Henrietta said, and meant it. "I am also aware," Marcus continued, "that Harlan Wick's financial representations to your father at the time of the engagement discussions were, I will use the precise term, fraudulent." I have, as of this morning, been in receipt of documentation that would support a formal complaint to that effect." She looked at Clark again. He had his hat in his lap and was turning the brim slowly in his fingers in a way she would come to know, in years ahead, as his tell for the moments when he was trying not to appear satisfied with himself. "You brought documentation," she said to him. "I brought documentation," he confirmed. "You have been very busy for a man who only rode into town 2 days ago." "I have been planning for this visit since approximately the middle of August," he said, "which gives a person some time to gather paperwork." She should have been annoyed by this. The careful engineering of it, the preparation, the various conversations she had not been aware of, she should have felt manipulated. Instead, sitting in Marcus Alney's cool office with the thick, warm smell of old documents around her and the justice of the peace looking at her with that steady, kind attention, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. Not the false safety of a lie dressed as security. The real kind. The kind that comes from knowing that the person beside you is paying attention to the same things you are paying attention to, and has been for a longer time than you realized. "What do we need to do?" she asked. The paperwork was not extensive. Texas state law in 1882 allowed for civil marriage performed by a justice of the peace, requiring the consent of both parties, a marriage license, and 2 witnesses. The license required a small fee and a waiting period of, in theory, 72 hours, though there was a provision in the statute for a judge or justice of the peace to waive the waiting period under circumstances he deemed sufficient. Marcus Alney, who had served as Justice of the Peace in Dustfall County for 9 years and who had, in his own considered opinion, seen sufficient circumstances, deemed them sufficient. "I will need 2 witnesses," he said, "and I will need 30 minutes to prepare the paperwork properly." Henrietta looked at Clark. Clark looked at Henrietta. "My father," she said, "and my foreman," Clark said, "Bo Ridley. He arrived in town with me 2 days ago and is currently at the livery." She had not known this either. He had brought a witness. He had come prepared for this exact outcome. She felt briefly and entirely like laughing. "Gerald Grady and Bo Ridley," Marcus said, writing it down. 30 minutes. I suggest you find them both and return here by midday." The midday sun of Dustfall, Texas, in September was not a gentle thing. It lay across the street like a physical weight and bleached the color out of everything it touched and made the shadows very dark by contrast. Henrietta walked out into it beside Clark Ashford and thought about the word irreversible. They had not touched yet. There had been no dramatic declaration, no embrace in the middle of the open grassland, no cinematic kiss in the doorway of the justice's office. They had been, instead, 2 people engaged in the process of solving a very complicated problem, and the love between them, because she was allowing herself to use that word now, quietly and certainly, had been expressed not in any of the traditional vocabulary, but in the more reliable language of someone showing up when it matters and telling the truth when it costs something. She reached out and took his hand. It was not dramatic. It was simply a decision made with the same quiet completeness as all the other decisions in this day, and his hand closed around hers with a steadiness that felt like a promise already kept. "We need to walk past the church to get back to the store," she said. "I know. Harlan will likely still be there, or near it." "Probably," Clark said. They walked. The street was, perhaps, slightly more populated than it had been earlier, in the way that streets in small towns tend to be on mornings when something significant has happened at the local church. People found reasons to be out of doors. There was a particular quality to the attention of a community that is paying very close attention while pretending to do other things. Harlan Wick was standing outside the church with 2 men she recognized as employees from his ranch, and he saw them coming from half a block away. She watched his face process the sight of Clark Ashford and Henrietta Grady walking down his main street in the full light of the midday sun, holding hands, and the expression that moved across it was the particular expression of a man who is realizing that a situation he thought he controlled has moved significantly outside his control. She kept her eyes straight ahead and her chin level, and she walked with the measured step of a woman who has made a decision and does not require anyone's approval for it. Harlan stepped into their path. He was wearing his good clothes, she noticed. He had dressed for the wedding too, the wedding that had not happened, and the good clothes looked somewhat wrong on him now, overdressed for the afternoon he was actually about to have. "Henrietta," he said. She stopped. Clark stopped beside her. "Harlan," she said calmly. "I don't know what this man has told you," Harlan said, and his voice had that sharp edge again, the one beneath the smoothness. "But I think you need to consider very carefully what you are doing here, and what it will mean for your father and his situation in this community. When certain information—" "Mr. Wick," Clark said pleasantly, "I believe you are referring to certain documentation that you have been using as leverage in your negotiations with Reverend Crail, and through that arrangement, with Miss Grady and her family." Harlan's eyes moved to Clark. There was something in them that Henrietta recognized as the recalculation happening in real time, the assessment of how much Clark knew and how that changed the arithmetic. "I don't know what you think you know," Harlan said. "I know about the San Antonio bank note," Clark said, still pleasantly. "I know about the actual headcount of your herd, as verified by 3 separate witnesses who were present for last month's inventory, whose sworn statements I have with me. I know about the misrepresentation made to Gerald Grady in June with respect to the financial standing of your operation." Harlan's face had gone a particular color that was not healthy. "I also know," Clark continued, "that the matter you have been threatening to make public regarding Gerald Grady's history involves a land preceding the underlying title to which was obtained through fraudulent means by your grandfather, which makes the subsequent legality of that proceeding somewhat interesting from a property law perspective, particularly in light of certain reform efforts currently under discussion in Austin." The 2 ranch hands behind Harlan looked at each other. "You have no," Harlan started. "I have every piece of paper I just described," Clark said. "Copies are already held by Marcus Alney, the justice of the peace. Originals are deposited with the county clerk in San Antonio." A slight pause. "I have been preparing this particular conversation since August, Mr. Wick. I apologize for how long it has taken." Harlan Wick stared at Clark Ashford for a long, charged moment. She could feel the anger in him, could see it in the set of his jaw, and she was briefly aware that this was a moment that could go in more than one direction. But Harlan Wick, for all his calculating cruelty, was not a man who took risks he calculated he would lose. His whole personality was built around the management of outcomes and the avoidance of consequences, and he was smart enough to read the numbers in front of him. He looked at Henrietta. His expression shifted into something harder to read, not contrition. She did not think he was capable of that, but perhaps a kind of grudging acknowledgement that he had underestimated something. "You made your choice," he said to her, not to Clark, to her. "I did," she said. He stepped back. He let them pass. She heard him say something to the ranch hands behind them as they walked away, but she did not turn to listen, and in a few seconds the distance absorbed his voice, and she was focused on the forward movement, the store ahead, her father's blessing already in her pocket, Marcus Alney's office at the other end of the street, the sun moving steadily overhead. "Will he do anything more?" she asked quietly. "He will be too occupied with his own situation to be a significant problem," Clark said. "The bank will need to be addressed by spring. He has enough to think about without turning his attention toward people who have made clear that they are prepared to respond proportionately." "Is that what you would call what just happened? Proportionate?" "I would call it prepared," Clark said, and this time the almost smile became the actual thing. Bo Ridley was at the livery, as Clark had said. He was 35, red-faced from the sun, with the kind of cheerful competence that made him a reliable presence in any situation. He shook Henrietta's hand when Clark introduced them, and said he was real glad to meet her, and he had heard a great deal about her, and Clark threw him a look that he had the good sense to partially interpret. They collected Gerald from the store. He had put on his good coat while they had been gone, Henrietta noticed. The dark wool one he wore for church and formal occasions, the one that hung slightly loose on him now but still had its original dignity. He had combed his hair. He had the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment for a long time and is, now that it has arrived, quite ready for it. They walked back to Marcus Alney's office. The four of them, Henrietta and Clark and Gerald and Beau, and the street watched them go, and all the various people who had been finding reasons to be outdoors found reasons to be looking in their direction, and Henrietta kept her hand in Clark's and did not concern herself with the looking. Marcus Alney's office at a few minutes before noon was full of the particular quality of light that comes through half-drawn curtains on a bright day, bars of gold and shadow alternating across the floor and the desk, and the faces of the people gathered in it. Marcus had the paperwork prepared with the careful neatness of a man who has always taken documentation seriously. He had moved a small side table in from an adjacent room and placed a vase of wildflowers on it, yellow and white, the kind that grew in the uncultivated spaces at the edge of town, and this detail, small and apparently domestic, made something ache in Henrietta's chest in the best possible way. "We are all here," Marcus said, looking at the four of them. "Let us begin." The ceremony was simple. It was not what she had imagined when she had been small and imagining weddings, which had involved the church and the flowers and the neighbors and the particular social theater of that occasion. It was small and immediate and real in a way that the church ceremony, with its audience and its performance and its fundamental dishonesty, had never had any hope of being. Marcus read from the civil marriage statute. He asked the required questions. Clark answered his with a quiet directness that made her feel, each time she heard his voice, that she was standing on solid ground. When it was her turn, she looked at him, at his gray storm-cloud eyes and his weathered honesty, and the 6 months of waiting and preparation and eventual return that had brought them to this particular room on this particular September noon. And she said yes with her whole self, not just her voice. They signed the document. Gerald and Beau signed as witnesses. Marcus signed and stamped and dated it. And that was it. That was the thing that had seemed for months an impossible problem, the trap, the forced choice, the hidden motives and dark past and forbidden future, and it had resolved itself into a piece of paper, and two people standing in a small room in the noon light in Dustfall, Texas, on September 5, 1882. Gerald Grady embraced his daughter for a long moment, and she felt the fragility of him, and held on carefully and thought about how much she loved him, and how much she hoped the letter he was going to write would bring him some peace, whatever else it did. Clark shook Gerald's hand, and then Gerald held Clark's hand in both of his for a moment and looked at him and said, "Take care of her." Not in the way of a man issuing instructions to a subordinate, but in the way of a man passing a sacred thing to someone he has decided to trust. "Yes, sir," Clark said. "I will." Beau Ridley shook both their hands with great enthusiasm and said he had a bottle of something in his saddlebag if anyone was interested. And Marcus Alney said he preferred to be left out of that particular aspect of the celebration, but wished them every happiness. They emerged from Marcus Alney's office into the bright afternoon, married by every law of the state of Texas, before sundown. The sun was high and fierce, and the shadows were very short, and the sky was that particular deep blue of September that Henrietta had always thought was the best sky Texas ever produced. Clark looked at her sidelong. "How are you?" She considered the question seriously, taking stock of herself in the way she had always done when something significant had happened, that internal accounting. "Terrified," she said, "and entirely certain, both at once." "That sounds about right," he said. "Are we going to talk about the fact that you have had a wedding plan prepared since August?" "We could talk about that," he said. "Or we could go find something to eat because I have not had breakfast and I imagine you have not either, and I find conversations about planning and preparation go better when I am not hungry." That is a very pragmatic response to what I was implying. "What you were implying is that I was presumptuous," he said. "And you are correct. I was presumptuous. I was also correct about the outcome, which I understand does not make the presumption less presumptuous, but it does make it easier to live with. I am sorry, and I would have adapted to any other outcome. But I am not sorry that I came prepared." "I am not either," she admitted. He stopped walking and looked at her, and his expression was the one he had not shown very often in the hours of this complicated day, not the practical focus of a man executing a plan but the unguarded version, the one she had first seen in March across the hardware store counter, open and unexpectedly young and full of a feeling that was, she now understood, exactly what she felt when she looked at him. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I am very glad I came back," he said, simply and completely. "I would have been for the rest of my life the poorer version of myself if I had not." "You are," he paused, looking for the word, "you are the specific person, the one I was talking around the edges of when I talked about light in March without knowing that was what I was doing." She felt the truth of it settle into her, quiet and large and entirely without drama, the thing she had been not naming for 6 months. "I love you," she said, the first time out loud in the air in the September afternoon. "I am aware that this is a somewhat abbreviated courtship by conventional standards. 6 months of thinking about someone is a perfectly respectable courtship," he said. "The 6 months just happened to occur between 2 conversations rather than during them." She laughed, and it was her real laugh, the ungainly one she did not bother to manage, and he was looking at her when it happened with an expression of such specific and focused happiness that she felt the word home arrive in her without any announcement, the way words do when they have always been true, and you have simply not had the occasion to think them. He kissed her then in the middle of the street, in the bright September noon, with the dust and the light and the watching town as witness. It was not a brief, public propriety kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who have been patient for a long time and are no longer going to be, and whatever the town of Dustfall thought of it, neither of them cared at all. The afternoon that followed was less dramatic and more substantial than the morning, which was, Henrietta thought, the nature of real things. Real things, after the crisis that brings them into being, require the work of arrangement. They sat at the table in the back of the hardware store with Gerald, and worked through the immediate practical matters, with the focused attention of people who understand that love and logistics are not opposites but companions. Clark's position at the Alcott Ranch. The foreman post was to begin in 2 weeks. The house that came with it was small but solid. Henrietta's first concern was her father, who could not be left without support in Dustfall, and this concern was real and not negotiable. Clark had anticipated this too, though she was beginning to feel that he had anticipated most things. "I have spoken by letter with a man named Elias Grover," he said, "who worked for 2 years as a store manager in Abilene before the store he managed was bought out. He is looking for a position. He is honest, competent, and I have references for him from 3 people whose judgment I trust. He would not be a replacement for Gerald in any deep sense, but he would be capable of running the day-to-day operations." Gerald looked thoughtful. "I am not entirely without capacity," he said, with a faint dignity. "No, sir," Clark said. "You are certainly not. I envision it as a partnership rather than a replacement. You provide the knowledge of the store and the customer relationships and the business judgment of 20 years. He provides the physical management of the stock and the accounts. It would allow you to rest more than you currently do, without giving up the work entirely." Gerald considered this for a long moment, turning it over with the thoroughness of a man who has managed his own affairs for a long time and does not surrender control easily. "He would need to meet with me," Gerald said. "He is already on his way," Clark said, and Henrietta pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger and looked at her husband, and felt the specific mixture of amusement and exasperation and deep appreciation that she suspected would be a recurring feature of their shared life. "You sent him a letter in August," she said. "Early September," Clark said. I was not entirely certain of my reception until I actually arrived in Dustfall, but sufficiently certain to write the letter. I live in hope, he said. It is an imperfect system, but it has its advantages. Gerald Grady was watching this exchange with an expression that was, for the first time in months, genuinely cheerful. I believe, he said, that the two of you will get along fine. The afternoon moved. The light changed, going from the flat white of noon to the amber warmth of mid-afternoon, and Henrietta walked through it, making the arrangements that would constitute the visible architecture of this new life, speaking with Mrs. Firth about the rental of the small house on the south side of town, where she and Clark would stay for the 2 weeks before moving to the Alcott Ranch, handling the questions of clothing and household goods, and the careful selection of what to take and what to leave, the endless practical poetry of beginning. At one point in the middle of the afternoon, she ran into Reverend Crail near the general store. He was walking with his head down, and he nearly stepped into her path before he saw her, and when he did see her he stopped, and his face went through a series of expressions she did not try to interpret. "Henrietta," he said. "Reverend," she said. He stopped, tried again. "I am told you and Mr. Ashford were married by Marcus Alney this morning." "We were." "I am glad," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, that underneath whatever else was in him, the fear of Harlan Wick, the compromises he had made, the long complicit silence, there was genuine care for her, the remnant of the man who had known her since she was 12 years old. "I know you have been in a difficult position," she said. She did not excuse it, but she did not add to his burden either. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "About Harlan Wick and what he was doing, I should have come to you months ago." "You should have," she agreed honestly. "But you did not, and things have resolved without any permanent damage. If you want to make amends for the silence, you can begin by treating my father with the same regard you have always shown him, when people in this town start repeating things they have heard from Harlan Wick." The Reverend straightened slightly. "Harlan Wick's ability to damage anyone in this town is considerably diminished as of this morning," he said. "I believe you may not be aware that there was a visitor to the bank this morning, the local branch, and that certain documentation regarding Mr. Wick's financial representations was presented. I do not know the details, but I understand that Harlan Wick spent most of this afternoon in a meeting with his lawyers." Henrietta thought about Clark turning his hat brim in his fingers. "I see," she said. "Your husband is a thorough man," Reverend Crail said, with a faint and rueful smile. "He is," she agreed, and felt the word husband in her mouth like a word she had learned in a new language and was surprised to find she already knew. Evening came to Dustfall with the particular ceremony of a West Texas sunset, which was never understated and never brief, a long theatrical production of color that moved through orange and rose and a deep bruised purple before finally conceding to the dark. Henrietta stood on the small porch of the rented house, theirs now, at least for 2 weeks, with its 2 rooms and its creaking boards and its single lamp in the hall that she had placed there herself, the first thing before anything else, and watched it happen. Clark came to stand beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that he had made on the small stove in the back room with the focus and deliberateness he brought to everything, and he handed her one and stood with her in the cooling air while the colors changed. "Do you know," she said, "that for the past 6 months I have been telling myself that what I felt in March was an impractical daydream that a sensible woman would put aside. And now I am married to it," she said. "Which suggests my judgment of what is sensible may have required some revision." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, when I was about 40 miles out of Dustfall, riding back in August, I stopped and made myself sit with the worst case. Made myself actually think about what I would do if you had already been married by the time I arrived, if the ceremony had already happened. What would you have done? Ridden on," he said. "Gone to the Alcott Ranch, taken the job, lived a smaller life than I wanted to live, but an honest one." He paused. "And thought about West Texas, light probably more than was strictly healthy for a working man." She turned to look at him in the fading light. His face was all warm color from the sunset, the gray eyes very clear, and he was looking at her with the same focused attention he had always given her, that quality of being looked at completely, without armor or agenda, just the full and honest weight of someone's regard. "You knew in March," she said. "When you left." "Yes," he said. "Why did you not say anything before you rode out?" He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to tell her he had thought about this specific question many times. "Because you were not free," he said finally. "Not the way I would want you to be free. You were managing your father's illness and the store and the particular arithmetic of a very difficult situation, and I was a man you had known for 3 days. It seemed disrespectful to tell you something that would complicate your choices without offering anything concrete to help address those complications. So I left, and I spent 6 months making something concrete." "6 months," she said, soft. "6 months is not very long," he said, "to fall in love with a specific person. But it is long enough." She set her coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to him fully, and he was already looking at her, and the air between them had the particular charge of the final moment before something irreversible happens, not with fear but with the recognition of something being completed. "Come inside," she said, "before we lose the light entirely." His smile was slow and warm and entirely his own. "After you," he said. The weeks that followed were the first weeks of an entirely new mathematics, and Henrietta, who had always been good at arithmetic, found this particular form of it more interesting than any she had previously encountered. They were two people learning each other not in the abstract way of courtship, but in the immediate daily way of shared space, shared meals, shared decisions, shared silences. She learned that Clark Ashford made coffee too strong and would not be argued out of it. She learned that he read when he could, that he had a small collection of well-worn books in his saddlebag, histories and novels, and one volume of poetry he had been carrying so long that the spine had been repaired twice with strips of leather. She learned that he had a dry, measured humor that appeared when he felt safe and disappeared when he felt observed, and that the fact that it appeared around her with increasing frequency was, she understood, a form of trust. He learned that she argued with ledgers, that she had opinions about the placement of every object in any shared space, that she admitted this without embarrassment, not a morning person in any natural sense but had been one for years out of necessity, and that given a morning without obligation she would stay in bed reading until 9:30 without any particular remorse. He learned that she had a deep and genuine tenderness for animals, that she could not pass a horse without speaking to it, and that she had views about the treatment of working animals that were more extensive and detailed than any he had previously encountered. He learned that she cried, occasionally, for no obvious reason, and that when he asked about it she would say, accurately, that she was simply feeling the full weight of something that needed feeling, and that this was a practice he came to understand and eventually to admire. The move to the Alcott Ranch was accomplished on a bright morning in late September, the wagon loaded with the practical contents of a life that was beginning to accumulate the texture of permanence, and the 40-mile drive was one of those long days that became, in retrospect, one of the specific things a person is glad they paid attention to: the sky, the grass, the quality of the air. The conversation that moved between everything and nothing, the way good conversation does when two people are comfortable with each other. The house was small. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen and a porch that faced east, which meant it caught the morning light in a way that Henrietta declared immediately was ideal, and Clark had the expression of a man who had specifically selected the eastern-facing house because he remembered something someone had said about morning light in March. "You chose this house for the light," she said. "I chose it because it was available," he said with great dignity. "Clark Ashford. And because it faced east," he conceded. She stood on the porch of her new home in the morning light of the last day of September and felt, with a completeness that had no anxiety in it, that she had arrived at the right place. Not the place she had planned on, not the place that had seemed 6 months ago like the only available option, The right place, which was different. Elias Grover arrived in Dustfall that same week and met with Gerald Grady, and the meeting went better than expected, primarily because Elias Grover was the kind of person who understood immediately that he was not there to replace anything but to support something, and Gerald Grady, who was perceptive in the way of men who have spent a lifetime reading people, recognized this. The partnership Gerald had dismissed as a surrender became, within the first month, something he admitted was actually allowing him to breathe more easily, in both the metaphorical and the literal sense. Gerald's letter was written and sent, with Clark's assistance in directing it to the right parties in Austin. The process of addressing the land matter was slow and bureaucratic, as such processes always are, but it was real and it moved forward, and the knowledge that it was moving seemed to lighten something in Gerald's bearing, as though the act of acknowledgement itself had value independent of the outcome. The autumn settled over the ranch country with the particular generosity of a good Texas fall, warm days and cool nights, and a sky that did not seem to know how to stop being beautiful. Henrietta learned the Alcott Ranch as she learned most things thoroughly, and with a genuine interest that had nothing performed about it. She got to know the hands and the horses and the rhythms of the operation, and she found that a foreman's wife on a working ranch had both more authority and more responsibility than she had expected, and that the combination suited her considerably. She also found, as November arrived with its first real cold, that she was pregnant. She told Clark on a Sunday evening when the first real frost had come, and the house was warm with the fire he had built that afternoon, and he went very still in the way of a person receiving a piece of information that is too large to process at ordinary speed. She watched his face move through surprise and a kind of mathematical computation, and then, arriving at the other side of it, something that opened in him like light through a window and was, she understood, straightforward joy. He crossed the room and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she felt his heart going fast against her chest and thought about the trap that had almost closed on her in September, and about the Reverend's refusal, and about Marcus Alney's wildflowers in the vase. And she thought, with a gratitude that was large and warm and entirely without reservation, about the fact that a great many things that had seemed like disasters had turned out to be the machinery of a very good outcome. "A boy or a girl, do you think?" Clark asked when he had been able to speak again. "I think we will find out in approximately 7 months," she said. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, I know that." A pause. "I would like a boy first if I get to have preferences." "I will pass that along," she said, and he laughed, that real laugh she had come to love, the one that came from somewhere unguarded. The winter was the first winter they spent together in the small house with its eastern porch and its strong coffee and its lamp always in the hall, and it was the kind of winter that teaches you things about a person that no other season can. She learned that he was, in cold weather, almost aggressively warm, that he ran hot, as her mother would have said, and that this made the small house feel smaller in a way she did not at all mind. She learned that he worried, quietly and without expressing it, in the way of men who have learned to manage anxiety internally, and that the things that worried him were almost always the people he cared about rather than any abstract threat. She learned that his birthday was January the 9th, and that he had never, as an adult, made any particular occasion of it, and that the dinner she made for him that evening with the specific dishes she had spent a week determining from careful observation of his preferences, was the kind of thing that undid him completely and quietly, in the way that unexpected care tends to undo people who have spent a long time not expecting it. He learned her winters, which were inward in the way that introverts' winters are, and he did not require her to perform sociability when she did not have it, and she found this not just considerate but clarifying, the ongoing experience of a person who loves you accurately, who sees what you actually need rather than what they think you should need. In February of 1883, a letter arrived from the Austin contact regarding the land matter. The process was ongoing, as expected, but the fraudulent nature of the original title had been confirmed by a review of the original documentation, and there were formal proceedings moving forward that would, in time, result in either restitution to the descendants of the displaced family or significant financial compensation from the estate of the original speculator's heirs. The letter also noted that Gerald Grady's testimony, having been obtained under documented coercion rather than free will, had been formally reconsidered in the record, which did not erase what had happened but acknowledged its context with more honesty than the original proceeding had. Henrietta read this letter twice and then went and found Clark, who was in the barn doing something with a harness, and she handed it to him without speaking. He read it and looked up, and she put her arms around him in the cold of the barn, and he held her, and she let herself feel the full weight of relief, which was different from happiness but was its necessary precursor. She wrote her father a long letter that evening, telling him everything the Austin letter had contained, and the letter she received back from Gerald Grady 3 weeks later was, in its own particular voice and its particular mix of grief and gratitude, the most honest thing he had ever written to her. Spring arrived with an extravagance that felt deliberate, the hills going green in a way that seemed almost argumentative after the winter's brown restraint, and Henrietta, who was very large by March and had strong opinions about this condition and its attendant inconveniences, found that the quality of the spring light was better than she remembered it being in previous years, though she acknowledged this might have been influenced by other factors. Clark was, during this period, a man engaged in the performance of careful helpfulness in ways that he tried to make look casual and mostly failed. He checked on her more than she strictly required. He made additions to the kitchen that were clearly motivated by the desire to reduce the number of things she had to reach for. He read to her in the evenings, which she had not asked for but found she loved, and they went through 3 books over March and April that way. A history of the cattle trade that was his suggestion, a novel she had brought from the store that was hers, and the poetry collection from his saddlebag, which they read through slowly, a few pages at a time, and which produced conversations that went on well past the point when the lamp needed refilling. The baby arrived on the 22nd of April, 1883, at approximately 4 in the morning, attended by the midwife from the neighboring ranch and by Clark, who had the specific focused calm of a man managing a high-stakes situation by sheer willpower and who, when it was over and she placed the baby in his arms for the first time, became, very briefly and without any embarrassment, entirely undone. It was a boy. He weighed 8 pounds and had dark hair and his father's gray eyes, which were already, even at 4 in the morning, looking at the world with a quality of assessment that Henrietta found both highly specific and entirely familiar. "What do we call him?" Clark asked, sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding the baby with the careful precision of a man who is not going to make any mistakes with this particular thing. She had thought about this for months. "James," she said, "for your father." She had learned over the winter that Clark's father had died when he was 19, and that his name had been James, and that the subject carried a weight she respected by not pressing on it, but had not forgotten. Clark looked up at her from the baby. His expression was something she did not try to name because it was too large for any single word. "James Gerald Ashford," he said, "if you want your father's name in there." "James Gerald Ashford," she agreed. The years that followed were the years that come after the crisis, after the resolution, after the machinery of fate or providence or coincidence has done its work, and the life that remains needs to be built by ordinary human hands with ordinary human patience. They were good years. Not without difficulty. The drought year of 1886 was brutal, and there were seasons of cattle sickness and fence disputes, and the specific grinding anxiety of making a life work in a country that was not inclined to make it easy, but good years, built on a foundation that was genuine in every element, and consequently solid in a way that no amount of difficulty could fundamentally undermine. Harlan Wick lost his ranch to the bank in the spring of 1883, as Clark had projected. He left Dustfall County and was heard from only occasionally through secondary reports. Someone had seen him in Abilene. Someone else thought he had gone east. The various unconvincing rumors that attach themselves to men who leave in disgrace. He was never a major presence in Henrietta's life again, and she found that the space he had occupied in her thoughts, which had been significant during the awful months of the engagement, contracted rapidly and completely once the actual threat he represented was removed. Reverend Crail remained in Dustfall and preached every Sunday, and was, in Henrietta's estimation, a better man for having been forced to examine his own cowardice in the crisis of September 1882. He was not the same reverend who had slammed his Bible shut in front of the altar, or rather, he was still that man, but he was also the man who had looked at Henrietta Grady across the aisle with an expression full of apology, and who had found, in the end, that his conscience outweighed his fear. She respected him, imperfectly and honestly, in the way that one respects people who are human and trying. Marcus Alney served as Justice of the Peace for another 12 years, and was, at every celebration of the Ashford family's anniversaries, given the specific and genuine gratitude of two people who had not forgotten what his 30 minutes of careful paperwork had meant. Gerald Grady's health, contrary to the grim arithmetic that Henrietta had been calculating in 1882, improved somewhat after the weight of the hidden past was lifted from him. He never recovered fully. The lung complaint that had been troubling him did not resolve, but he lived for 6 more years after the marriage, years in which he was present for the births of his grandchildren and the consolidation of a store he had built from nothing into something that would outlast him, managed by Elias Grover with Gerald's oversight until Gerald no longer had the energy to oversee, and then with a care that honored the thing it had been given custody of. He died in the spring of 1888, peacefully, in the room above the store, with Henrietta beside him and his grandchildren in the house below. James Gerald Ashford, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of pressing his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger when he was thinking hard, grew up on the Alcott Ranch with the particular freedom of a child raised in open country by two people who paid serious attention. He had, by the age of 4, definite opinions about horses, and by the age of 6, a grasp of basic arithmetic that he appeared to have assembled spontaneously, and which he applied primarily to the management of his father's hat collection, which he had reorganized by some system of his own devising that his parents declined to disrupt. In 1885, a girl arrived. Clara Inez Ashford, named for a graytan on Clark's mother's side, who had the Grady family's dark eyes and a laugh that started in her belly and could be heard across the yard. Then, in 1887, another boy, Thomas William Ashford, who was, from the beginning, the quietest of the three, a small, serious person who watched everything. The family was, as these families go, a real one, which is to say complicated and imperfect and deeply, durably happy in the way that is only possible when the happiness is built on something true. There were disagreements and difficulties, and the ordinary attritions of a life lived closely with other people. There were nights when the coyotes were too loud and mornings when the work was too much and weeks when the weather was merciless and months when the accounts were frightening. There were all the things that come with a life in the wild and changeable country of West Texas in the latter part of the 19th century, which had never been and would never be a gentle landscape. But the foundation held. It held through everything because it was made of honest materials, a refusal that had looked like a catastrophe, and had turned out to be a liberation. A cowboy who had spent 6 months making himself ready instead of giving up. A woman who had chosen the real thing over the available thing, and a September afternoon in which all the preparation and all the waiting had been worth every single mile of it. On their 10th anniversary, September 5th of 1892, Clark and Henrietta Ashford stood on the eastern porch of the house that had seen a decade of their life together. James was 9 years old and inside arguing about something with Clara, who was 7, and Thomas was 4 and asleep already, worn out from a day of following the ranch hands around with the dedicated focus of a person conducting research. The sunset was doing its usual theatrical work, orange and rose and that deep bruised purple, and they stood with their coffee, still too strong after 10 years, and she had stopped arguing about it around year 3, and watched it. "Do you remember," Henrietta said, "what I said to you that afternoon in Marcus Alney's office, when you asked how I was?" "Terrified and entirely certain," Clark said immediately. "Both at once," she smiled. "That is still accurate." He looked at her sidelong, and the corner of his mouth moved into the actual smile, the one that had started as a precursor, and over 10 years had become one of the most familiar and still among the most moving sights in her particular world. "Terrified of what precisely at this point?" he asked. "Of how much there is to lose," she said, honestly. "Of how completely I would be undone without you and the children and this specific life." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the last of the sunset. "That sounds like love," he said. "Yes," she said, "it does." He reached over and took her hand, the same motion she had made in the street in Dustfall on the September afternoon 10 years ago, that small, decided gesture, and his hand closed around hers with the same steadiness it always had, the steadiness she had trusted on that first day and had every reason since to trust more completely. The sky moved through its colors, and the children's voices came faintly from inside, and the land stretched out before them with all its difficult beauty, the land of West Texas that Henrietta Grady Ashford had tried to leave twice and come back twice because something in it had its hooks in her, and that something, she now understood entirely, had been waiting patiently for the life she was now living to be ready to be lived. The lamp was in the hall. The coffee was too strong. The stars were beginning, out there at the edge of the darkening sky, to appear one by one with their usual indifference and their usual splendor, and she held her husband's hand on the porch of her home and felt, with a completeness that had no edges, the full and irreversible weight of a happiness that had been built from nothing false. The Reverend had refused, and a cowboy had found a way, and before sundown on a September day in 1882 in Dustfall, Texas, 2 people had signed their names on a piece of paper and begun the work of a life that would be, in every way that mattered, exactly what both of them had been looking for without knowing what to call it. And the light, the West Texas light, morning and afternoon and evening, the light she had tried once to describe to a stranger at a hardware store counter, and had found in the describing that she was also describing something else entirely, the light went on being what it had always been. Beautiful, specific, entirely its own. The stars came out fully over the ranch, bright and unambiguous in the black September sky, and inside, James had apparently won the argument with Clara, and Thomas slept on without knowing there had been one, and in the hall the lamp burned steadily, and on the porch 2 people sat down together in the cooling night and talked about nothing and everything in the easy, complete way of 2 people who have found the person they were looking for, and have nothing left to prove, and nowhere else to be.